Let me tell you something about the universe that nobody tells you in school. Nobody tells you that the stars aren't friendly. I grew up watching old science fiction movies, the kind where aliens land on Earth and either want to eat us or teach us how to meditate. Either they're monsters or they're wise. Either they're here to destroy or they're here to save. And somewhere in the back of my mind, as a kid growing up in a small house with a cracked driveway and a dad who worked double shifts, I always thought, if they're out there, they're better than us. I thought, surely, someone smarter than us has figured out how to stop fighting. I was wrong. And the moment I realized I was wrong, truly, deeply, bone-marrow wrong, was the night the Crethali fleet entered the Peloran star system and started killing everything that moved. That night changed what I believe about humanity. It changed what I believe about the word capable. And it changed what I believe about the word alone. Because here's what nobody understood before that night. Here's the thing that every news anchor got wrong, every diplomat got wrong, every military strategist sitting in a heated room with a coffee got wrong. The galactic sovereignty had been at war for 63 years. 63 years of slow, grinding resource wars across 9 inhabited star systems. 63 years of treaties that collapsed, of alliances that crumbled, of species that thought they were safe, until a Crethali bombardment cracker split their moon in two and used the debris as shrapnel against their cities. The sovereignty had their armies, their fleets, their battle stations, their centuries of military tradition, their warrior clans and their honor codes and their generals with names I couldn't pronounce if you gave me a week. And none of it was enough. None of it had ever been enough. The Crethali didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't fight to win territory. They didn't fight to secure resources. They fought to erase. They were patient in the way that glaciers are patient. They would press and press and press until the thing in front of them had no more room to exist. And when the thing stopped existing, when the last transmission from the last outpost went dark, they moved on to the next thing. That was the universe when humanity made first contact. That was the universe waiting for us when we finally looked up and said, "Hello, is anyone out there?" And the answer came back, it always comes back, yes, and you picked a bad time to show up. The council that voted. There's a recording of the Galactic Sovereignty Emergency Council session from what we'd call October of 2087. It's 29 minutes long. I've watched it, or at least I've watched the translated version that the Sovereignty Media Bureau eventually released, with the audio processed so human ears could handle the frequency range. There are 9 species in that room. The Velhari, who look like tall gray herons with too many joints in their necks. The Dorvac, who are roughly the size of a small car and communicate partially through color shifts in their exoskeletal plates. The Nesari, who are so thin and translucent that, when the council chamber lighting hits them wrong, you can see their organs working. And 5 others that I still don't have good words for, because my language wasn't built to describe them. They are arguing about whether to contact Earth. And the argument isn't going well. The Velhari representative, his name translates roughly as first speaker of the Calm River delegation, which gives you some idea of how different their naming conventions are. He's explaining, in very measured tones, that humanity is a pre-contact species, that the sovereignty has protocols, that there are rules about exposing developing civilizations to galactic-scale warfare, that bringing humanity into this conflict would be, in his estimation, equivalent to arming children. The Dorvac representative, and you can tell she's agitated because her plates are cycling through a kind of deep amber that the translation notes flag as controlled anger, says that they don't have the luxury of protocol anymore, says that the Peloran system is going to fall within 90 cycles, says that after Peloran falls, the Crethali will have a clear corridor straight through the sovereignty's interior, and at that point the war is effectively over. The Nesari representative says nothing for a long time, and then he says something that the translator renders as, "We have run the projections 14,000 times. In 12,996 of those projections, we lose. The variants that change the outcome share one common variable." There's silence in the chamber. "The human military," he says. "The question is not whether to contact them. The question is whether they will come." The Velhari representative, in what I think was the understatement of the century, responds, "They will come." And he was right. but he had no idea what that meant. The transmission. The transmission reached Earth on October 14, 2087 at 3:22 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. A monitoring station in New Mexico picked it up first. There was a night shift technician named Reyes working the console. I talked to him years later, and he described the moment as deeply anticlimactic. He said the equipment flagged the signal as anomalous. He sat up straighter, and then his first thought was that something had gone wrong with the calibration. He said, "I remember thinking, great, I'm going to have to fill out a malfunction report. Then I ran the second diagnostic. Then I ran it again. And then I went and got my supervisor." His supervisor's name was Dr. Aisha Park. She was 43 years old. She'd been working in signals analysis for 19 years, and she was drinking her third cup of coffee of the night when Reyes knocked on her door. She looked at the readings. She put her coffee down. She picked up the phone. 3 hours later, the signal had been confirmed by 6 independent stations across 4 continents. 2 hours after that, the translation protocols that humanity had developed, somewhat optimistically, most people had thought, over the previous 4 decades were being applied to the signal. By noon on October 14th, the leaders of the major spacefaring nations and the heads of the Global Space Alliance were reading the translated message. I've seen the message. The full text has been public for years now. But I want to read you just the opening, because I think it matters. To the inhabitants of the third planet of the Sol system, we are the Galactic Sovereignty Emergency Council, speaking on behalf of 9 spacefaring civilizations currently engaged in survival-level conflict with the Krethali expansion. We are aware that this transmission violates established protocols for per-contact civilizations. We are making this contact because we have no remaining options. The Krethali will reach your system in an estimated 47 standard years regardless of this conflict's outcome. We are asking for military assistance. We understand if you refuse. That last sentence. We understand if you refuse. I've thought about that sentence a lot. Because whoever wrote it, whoever in the sovereignty drafted that message, they clearly expected the answer to be no. They wrote it like people who were preparing for disappointment. Like people who had already run the math and decided to ask anyway, the way you ask for something you need but don't really believe you'll get. The reply from Earth took 6 days. 6 days of emergency sessions, of classified briefings, of arguments in every language and every political tradition on the planet. 6 days of every military strategist and diplomat and weapons analyst and ethicist being pulled into rooms with very bright lights and very strong coffee and being asked, "What do we do?" 6 days. And then the Global Space Alliance Secretary General, a Finnish woman named Marit Korhonen, who had spent 30 years navigating the political terrain of international space law, and who was, by all accounts, one of the most unflappable human beings who had ever lived, delivered Earth's response. It was 4 words. 4 words in English, then repeated in every major human language, one after another, like a drumbeat. Tell us where we're coming. What we had. Here's something I want to be clear about, because I think it gets glossed over when people tell this story. When Earth said we're coming, humanity did not have a war fleet. What humanity had in October of 2087 was a collection of vessels that had been designed for exploration, resource extraction, scientific research, and short-haul transportation between Earth, the Moon, and the early Mars colonies. The Global Space Alliance had a small patrol fleet, 15 vessels, primarily designed to intercept rogue asteroid trajectories and occasionally chase down the illegal resource extraction operations that popped up in the asteroid belt every few years. What humanity had was the Kepler station, a massive deep space research platform that had been under construction for 11 years and was about 60% complete, sitting at the L4 Lagrange point. What humanity had was the Ares program, a military space initiative that had been authorized 3 years earlier, primarily to give the major powers' militaries something to argue about in budget meetings, and which had produced exactly 4 prototype combat vessels, none of which had been tested in live conditions. What humanity had was ingenuity, manufacturing capacity, a deep and complicated relationship with violence, and this is the part people don't understand until they really sit with it, almost no experience with losing at scale. Think about that for a second. The Velhari had been fighting the Krethali, losing, regrouping, losing again, for 63 years. 63 years of military setbacks had built into their strategic culture a kind of careful, methodical caution. They had learned to pick their fights, to preserve what they had, to avoid engagements they weren't certain of winning. Humanity had no such learned caution. Humanity's military history, and I say this as someone who has studied it, who has read the histories, who has stood in the silence of places where terrible things happened and felt the weight of it, humanity's military history is not a history of careful preservation. It's a history of improvisation, of adapting under fire, of doing things that should not have worked and making them work anyway through sheer commitment to the idea that they had to work. The Krethali, as it turned out, had never fought an enemy like that. They had never fought an enemy that didn't know how to retreat. The shipyards. I want to talk about what happened in the 18 months between October 2087 and the first human fleet deployment. Because this is the part of the story that I think is actually the most extraordinary. The Global Space Alliance issued what it called the Emergency Mobilization Directive on October 22, 2087, 8 days after the sovereignty transmission. The directive essentially suspended all non-essential civilian space programs, redirected every major manufacturing facility that could be converted to military production, and called for volunteers. The response to the volunteer call was, and I'm saying this having looked at the actual numbers, unprecedented. Within 72 hours of the directive going public, the Alliance military had received more than 40 million applications, from every nation, from every background. Pilots, engineers, physicists, medics, programmers, welders, machinists, people who had never thought about military service in their lives and were suddenly, with an urgency that seemed to come from something deeper than patriotism, certain that this was what they were supposed to do. There's a woman named Corporal Denise Afalabi, later sergeant, later captain, later a name that appears on a memorial wall in Geneva, who wrote about her experience enlisting in a letter to her mother that was later published as part of a collection of wartime correspondence. She wrote, "I know you're going to ask why. You're going to say I have a job, a life, plans, and I don't have a good answer except this. Something is out there killing people and it's going to get to us eventually." And when I read that, when I really let myself understand that, I couldn't sit still anymore. I couldn't just keep going to work. Someone has to go. I don't understand why it feels like it has to be me, but it does, so I'm going. That letter was written by, as far as anyone can tell, millions of people simultaneously. Not those exact words, but that sentiment, that feeling, that stubborn, almost irrational conviction that someone has to go and it might as well be me. The shipyards ran around the clock. There are photographs from the Nevada Desert Facility, from the Siberian Orbital Launch Complex, from the Australian Outback Construction Yards, from the Brazilian Highlands Station. Photographs taken at 3 in the morning showing thousands of workers under floodlights, welding, machining, assembling. The shifts were 12 hours. The coffee was bad. The sleeping conditions were worse, and nobody left. An engineer named Marcus Webb, who worked the night shift at the Nevada facility for 11 straight months, described it later as the strangest experience of his life. He said people weren't miserable. That's the thing I couldn't get over. You'd expect, it's hard work, it's long hours, the stakes are unimaginably high. You'd expect people to be grim. And instead there was this, I don't know how to describe it, this atmosphere. Like everyone was aware that they were doing the most important thing they'd ever done. And that awareness made people lighter? Is that the right word? Like the weight of the situation somehow lifted the weight of everything else. In 18 months, humanity built a fleet. Not a perfect fleet. Not a fleet that any sovereignty admiral would have looked at with confidence. The ships were fast and maneuverable and armed with weapons that combined human kinetics engineering with what little the sovereignty had been able to share of their own weapons technology. A hybrid that our engineers had adapted in ways that surprised even the sovereignty's liaison team. But the fleet was real, and it was crewed by 340,000 humans who had come from every corner of the planet to stand in the gap. The Peloran system. By the time the first human fleet arrived at the edge of the Peloran system, the situation was exactly as bad as the projections had said it would be. The sovereignty had been fighting a holding action for 8 months. They'd lost 3 of the system's 6 inhabited stations. The planet Peloran Prime, home to a Velhari colony of approximately 12 million people, was under orbital siege. The Sovereignty's remaining fleet was badly mauled, operating on reduced power, their command structure disrupted by a series of precision strikes that had taken out 2 flagship vessels in a single engagement 3 weeks before the humans arrived. Admiral Priya Vasanthakumar, the officer commanding the first human fleet, a Tamil woman from Chennai who had spent 20 years in the Indian Space Navy before the consolidation into the Global Space Alliance, described her first view of the Peloran system in an interview she gave 5 years after the war. She said, "I've tried to find the right words for what I saw when we came out of the transit corridor. I'm not sure human language has them. The debris field alone, the wreckage of ships, stations, structures that had been there for decades, it was enormous. It extended across a volume of space that I couldn't even begin to quantify emotionally. I knew the numbers. We'd seen the intelligence reports. But actually being there, actually seeing the scale of what had happened, I sat in my command chair and I thought, who is going to look at us and think we can help?" She paused in the interview. Then she said, "And then I thought about the shipyards, about the people who built these ships, about Afalabi and Webb and the 40 million who volunteered in 72 hours. And I thought they're going to look at us and see exactly what we are. And what we are is enough." The human fleet made contact with the remaining Sovereignty command vessel at 600 hours on April 3, 2089. The Sovereignty Admiral, a Velhari named Siri Tava, whose translated name meant something like the one who measures the depth of still water, received Admiral Vasanthakumar's transmission, and according to his own later account, spent several seconds simply staring at the sensor readouts. Because the human fleet wasn't where he expected it to be. He had assumed, because all Sovereignty tactical doctrine would assume, that the humans would arrive at the system's outer edge and hold position, that they would spend time assessing the tactical situation, consulting, planning, that there would be days, perhaps, of coordination before any engagement. Instead, the human fleet had come out of transit corridor at high velocity and was already burning hard toward the inner system, toward the siege line around Peloran Prime. Siri Tava's communications officer reported that Admiral Vasanthakumar's transmission was incoming. He said in his account, "I expected her to ask me for a tactical briefing. Instead, she said, 'Admiral Siri Tava, we have reviewed your last known tactical data. We see 3 Krethali siege line elements and a command cluster. We are going to engage the siege elements from the flank while requesting you commit your remaining assets to the command cluster. Please confirm you can hold for 90 minutes. I told her 90 minutes was possible but would cost us heavily. She said, "Give us 60 and we will make it unnecessary." The Battle of Peloran Prime. I want to be honest about something. I'm not a military historian. I'm not a tactical analyst. And trying to describe the Battle of Peloran Prime in the kind of precise, coordinate-by-coordinate detail that military history usually demands, I'm not the right person for that. Other people have written those accounts, and they're good, and you should read them. What I can tell you is what I understand about what happened. What I can tell you is the texture of it. The human fleet hit the Krethali siege line from a vector that Krethali tactical doctrine apparently didn't consider. A steep engagement angle that put the humans above and inside the siege formation, in a position where the Krethali siege vessels couldn't bring their main armament to bear without breaking the formation itself. The Krethali, according to every analysis I've read, spent the first 12 minutes of the engagement trying to figure out what they were dealing with. Because humans fight dirty. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as the most precise description I can give. The Sovereignty's military traditions, across all the species that had been fighting this war, had developed something like a shared tactical language over 63 years of conflict. The Krethali knew how Velhari commanders thought. They knew how Dorvek heavy units maneuvered. They knew how Nesari signals intelligence operated. They had 63 years of data on how the Sovereignty fought. They had 0 data on how humans fought. And humans fight, apparently, in ways that make professional military observers physically uncomfortable to watch. There's a Velhari tactical officer named Fenvarath who was aboard Siri Tava's command vessel during the battle and who wrote a detailed account afterward. His description of watching the human fleet engage is remarkable. He wrote, "The human commander, Vasanthakumar, accepted exchange ratios that our doctrine would categorize as catastrophic, and pressed forward anyway. She sacrificed hull integrity on 3 vessels to open a lane through the siege formation that her faster ships then exploited at velocities our models suggested were structurally impossible to sustain. When 2 of her forward ships were disabled, she used their drift trajectories as cover for her flanking elements. I watched this and thought, she is not making mistakes. She is doing things that look like mistakes because we have no framework for an opponent who accepts this level of cost in exchange for position. The Crethali siege line broke after 44 minutes. Not because the human fleet destroyed it, because the Crethali fleet, confronted with an opponent whose tactical behavior they could not model, did what the Crethali had never done in 63 years of warfare. They retreated. They pulled back to reassess. And in the space that their retreat opened, the sovereignty's remaining assets, following Vasanthacumar's 60-minute promise with 16 minutes to spare, hit the Crethali command cluster and destroyed it. The siege of Pelorin Prime was broken. In the aftermath, Tsiaritava transmitted a single message to Vasanthacumar's flagship. The translation came back as, "You fight strangely. I don't want you to think that what happened at Pelorin Prime was the end of something. It wasn't the end, it was barely the beginning." The Crethali didn't fold after one battle. They didn't look at the humans and decide the math no longer worked. They pulled back, they reassessed, and then they did what they'd always done. They adapted and they pressed. What changed was the equation. What changed was that the sovereignty, for the first time in 63 years, had something they hadn't had, an ally who didn't know how to be beaten. I want to tell you about the months that followed Pelorin Prime, about the campaigns in the Drethani corridor, about the engagement at Voss Station, where a crew of 63 human engineers with no naval support and a single armed transport vessel held a critical relay station against a Crethali strike force for 19 hours until the second human fleet arrived. About the Battle of the Calvith Margin, which the sovereignty's own historians now describe as the turning point of the war. But before I get to those, before I tell you about the campaigns and the battles, and the moments where everything hung by threads so thin they shouldn't have held, I want to tell you about something smaller. Because the story of this war isn't just the big moments, it's the small ones, the ones that tell you something true about what humans are when things get hard enough. The crew of the Amaranth. The GSA vessel Amaranth was a mid-range combat transport, not a frontline warship, not a flagship, just one of the hundreds of vessels that made up the logistical backbone of the human deployment. It was crewed by 31 people. Its captain was a man named Roland Ichterberg, 41 years old. From Utrecht originally, though he'd been living in Auckland for 15 years before the war. He'd been a merchant marine, then a GSA logistics officer, then, after the mobilization directive, the captain of whatever they could give him. The Amaranth's job was resupply, moving equipment, ammunition, medical supplies, and personnel between rear support stations and the forward fleet positions. Not glamorous work, not the kind of work that ends up in the histories. Except for what happened on the 17th of September, 2089, in the Drethani corridor. The Amaranth was making a routine resupply run to the forward logistics point when its sensors picked up a distress signal. The signal was coming from a Nessari evacuation vessel that had been hit during a Crethali strike and was drifting, engines dead, life support running on emergency reserves, carrying approximately 400 Nessari civilians. The nearest sovereignty rescue asset was 6 hours away. The Amaranth was 20 minutes away. The problem was the geometry. The evacuation vessel had drifted into a space that put it uncomfortably close to a Crethali patrol route. Stopping to render assistance meant stopping within potential engagement range of Crethali forces, with a ship that was not designed for combat, crewed by 31 people, most of whom were logistical specialists with minimal combat training. Ichterberg called a crew meeting. He said by his own account that he wanted to be clear about the situation. He described the risk. He described the timeline. He said that according to GSA regulations, his primary obligation was to the mission and to his crew, and that he was legally empowered to continue on his route and file a report on the distress signal. And then he said, "I don't want to do that, I want to go get them, I want to know what the crew thinks." The vote was 31-0. The Amaranth altered course. What happened next was 5 hours that Ichterberg later described as the most frightening experience of his life. They reached the Nessari vessel. They established a docking connection, which took longer than planned because the coupling systems weren't compatible, and an engineer named Yoon Jae-soo improvised a solution with equipment that was not designed for the purpose. They began the evacuation. And then the Krethali patrol arrived. It was a single scout vessel, small, faster than the Amaranth, and the moment it identified the human ship at the location of the distress signal, it moved to intercept. Ichterberg did something that the Krethali, apparently, had never seen before. He didn't run, he didn't try to fight. He turned the Amaranth broadside to the Krethali scout, interposing his unarmed vessel directly between the scout and the Nessari evacuation vessel. He then opened a transmission channel to the Krethali scout, a direct, unsecured channel, and said, in a voice that his communications officer later described as unnervingly calm, "You will have to go through me." The Krethali scout held position. It was a standoff. 11 minutes. 11 minutes where the Amaranth sat between the Krethali vessel and 400 civilians, with no weapons, no reinforcements close enough to matter, and 31 humans who had just voted to risk their lives and apparently had no interest in revisiting that vote. At the 9-minute mark, Yoon Jae-soo reported that the evacuation transfer was complete. At 11 minutes, the Krethali scout broke off. To this day, nobody is entirely sure why. There are theories. Some analysts think the scout had received orders and was operating on a strict timeline. Some think that the calculus of engaging an unarmed vessel that clearly had no intention of moving simply didn't fit the Krethali pattern of operation. Some think that whatever passed for reason in Krethali decision-making simply found no response protocol for what Ichterberg was doing. What everyone agrees on is that the Amaranth completed its evacuation and resumed its route. That 397 Nessari civilians were delivered to safety, and that when the story reached the wider deployment, something shifted. Not in strategy, not in tactics. In the way the sovereignty looked at the humans. A Velhari commodore named Ashaveth, upon hearing the account, reportedly sat in silence for a long moment and then said something that her aide translated as, "They have no framework for retreat because it never occurs to them that they are supposed to be afraid." The Battle of VOSS Station. The relay station designated VOS 7 sat at a critical junction point in what the sovereignty's charts labeled the inner corridor. It was not a militarily impressive installation. It was essentially a communications hub, a platform roughly the size of a terrestrial sports stadium, bristling with antenna arrays and processing equipment, maintained by a permanent staff of about 120 sovereignty technicians and 40 human specialists from the GSA's Communications Engineering Division. When the Krethali launched their push into the inner corridor in November of 2089, VOS 7 was not considered a primary target. The main sovereignty defense lines were positioned further forward, and the strategic assumption was that the Krethali would engage those lines before ever reaching a secondary installation like VOS 7. The assumption was wrong. The Krethali sent a flanking force, relatively small by the scale of this war, but still considerably larger than anything VOS 7 had defense capacity to handle, around the main engagement. Their intent was to take out the relay hub and blind a significant portion of the sovereignty's command and control network. The station's sovereignty commander, a Dorvac named Rethgavath, transmitted an emergency evacuation request and began coordinating the removal of non-essential personnel. The GSA communications team, led by a woman named Chief Engineer Soo-min Han, informed Commander Rethgavath that they were not evacuating. Rethgavath, by his own account, did not immediately understand. He asked for clarification. Han clarified, the relay systems at VOS 7 supported command communications for 6 active engagement zones. If VOS 7 went dark, the sovereignty forces in those zones would be operating blind in the middle of live combat. The 43 GSA personnel at VOS 7 were not evacuating because the station needed to keep running, and they were the ones running it. Rethgavath reportedly asked, "Do you understand the force that is approaching?" Han reportedly said, "Yes, do you have any weapons we can use?" The station was not defenseless, but it was barely defended. There was a small complement of point defense systems, short-range automated weapons designed to intercept incoming missiles and debris, not to fight off an assault force. There were no combat personnel. What there were was 43 engineers, 8 communications specialists, and 3 GSA administrative staff, 43 of whom had never fired a weapon in a live combat situation. They fought for 19 hours. I want to sit with that number for a moment. 19 hours. They used the station's point defense systems, manually overriding the automated controls to allow human operators to target incoming assault craft. They used the station's maintenance tunnels, crawl spaces designed for technicians doing routine work on antenna arrays, as defensive positions. They used equipment that had no military application in ways that military equipment could not be used, because engineers, when you put them in impossible situations, do not think in terms of what things are designed to do. They think in terms of what things can do. At one point, and this detail is in Hand's after-action report, and I want to be careful to give it the weight it deserves. At one point, a breach was made in a secondary docking arm. 6 Krethali assault troops entered the station. 3 GSA engineers, none of whom had received anything beyond basic self-defense training, stopped them. The how of it isn't important. What's important is the why. Chief Han wrote in her report, "We could not allow them to reach the primary relay core. If the core went down, the 6 engagement zones would lose command and control. We estimated that would cost the sovereignty somewhere between 800 and 2,000 casualties in the first 4 hours alone. So we stopped them." Just like that, so we stopped them. Like it was the obvious thing. Like it was the only thing. Like the calculus was so simple that there was nothing else to say about it. Reinforcement arrived after 19 hours and 3 minutes. The station held. The relay systems never went offline. The 6 engagement zones maintained command and control throughout. Of the 43 GSA personnel at Voss Station, 38 were recovered alive. The sovereignty held a formal recognition ceremony 6 months later. Reth Gavath, who had been evacuated during the initial withdrawal and had spent those 19 hours coordinating what support he could from a safe distance, stood up in front of the assembled ceremony and said something that the translator rendered as, "I have served in the Sovereignty Defense Forces for 41 years. I have never in 41 years seen anything like what these people did. I asked a human once why they fight the way they do. She said, 'We fight that way because someone has to.' I thought about that for a long time. I think what she meant is, they believe that if someone must pay the price for a thing, they would rather it be them than anyone else. I don't know if that's courage or something else. I know it saved my people. What they didn't know about US. There's something I've been building toward, and I want to say it plainly now. The Krethali, in all the analysis that has been done since the war, in all the documents and intelligence assessments and tactical post-mortems, the Krethali made one fundamental error. They understood power. They understood numbers, firepower, strategic position, logistical capacity, the rate at which a civilization can build weapons versus the rate at which those weapons can be destroyed. They understood all of that very well. 63 years of warfare had made them extraordinarily sophisticated in that understanding. What they didn't understand was will. Not morale, exactly. Not just the willingness to fight, because plenty of species will fight when they have to. What they didn't understand was what happens to humans when you put them in a situation where the consequences of losing are too large to accept. We don't have a word for it in English, not a single word. We have phrases, fighting spirit, or never say die, or where there's a will there's a way, but none of those quite capture it. The Velhari called it Sarath Kevin, which translates roughly as the state of impossible determination. And by all accounts, it's a documented phenomenon in sovereignty xenopsychology. Most species exhibit it occasionally, under sufficiently extreme pressure. But the documentation on humans suggested something different in degree if not in kind. Something that came out differently, more consistently, more intensely. A sovereignty analyst named Murraylath, who spent 3 years embedded with human military units for research purposes, wrote in her assessment, "The humans are not fearless. This is critical to understand. They experience fear in a manner physiologically similar to most carbon-based intelligences. What is different is what they do with it. In most species, fear serves as a reliable signal to withdraw, to preserve, to find a less costly path. In humans, fear appears to frequently produce the opposite response. Not in all humans, not always, but consistently enough that it should be considered a strategic variable. When a human is afraid for something, not of something, but for something, for a person or a people or an idea, the fear does not inhibit. It accelerates. She wrote that in an academic assessment. But what she was describing was Terberg saying, "You will have to go through me." What she was describing was Hans' 43 engineers holding a relay station for 19 hours. What she was describing was 40 million volunteers in 72 hours. What she was describing was 4 words: tell us where we're coming. 6 months into the human deployment, the war hit what every historian now calls the turning point, the engagement at the Calveth Margin. The Calveth Margin was not a place so much as a designation, a volume of space at the edge of what the sovereignty considered its core territory, a region of dense asteroid formations and old stellar debris that had historically been a navigational obstacle and a tactical nightmare. The kind of space that neither side wanted to fight in, because visibility was poor, navigation was treacherous, and engagement distances were unpredictable. The Crethali forced it anyway. They had been watching the human deployments for 6 months. They had been adapting to human tactics, slowly, because adaptation against something genuinely novel takes time, but adapting. And their analysis, apparently, had led them to conclude that the one place where human advantages in improvisation and aggressive maneuvering would be neutralized was in close-quarters engagement in dense navigational terrain. So they pushed into the Calveth Margin with their largest force yet. Not a siege, not a flanking operation. A full, committed push designed to break the combined human sovereignty defense force and open a clear path to the core systems. What they did not account for was Admiral Vassanthacumer. Because Vassanthacumer had been thinking about the Calveth Margin for weeks. Her planning staff had analyzed it every way they knew how, and she'd reached a conclusion that her sovereignty counterparts found difficult to accept. She didn't want to defend the margin. She wanted to let the Crethali in. The trap. The meeting where Vassanthacumer presented her plan to the Joint Human Sovereignty Command is described in several accounts. I've read 3 of them, and they all agree on the basic shape of the room, if not the exact words. Vassanthacumer had prepared a 3-dimensional tactical display. The Calveth Margin was rendered in it as a dense field of asteroid clusters, each one tagged with navigational hazard ratings, and she had marked, through the middle of it, a series of transit corridors, the narrow, viable paths that any fleet would need to use to move through the margin. She explained her plan. The sovereignty would appear to fall back. Not dramatically, not a rout, but a measured withdrawal that would look to the Crethali like a calculated retreat to better defensive ground. The human fleet would stage in the margin itself, hidden in the asteroid clusters, running minimal power signatures. And when the Crethali fleet committed to the transit corridors, when they were deep in the margin, strung out along the narrow, viable paths, unable to maneuver, the human fleet would close the corridors behind them. Tsiritava's response to this plan, as recorded by his aide, was, the humans would be trapped in the same space as the Crethali. Vassanthacumer's response was, yes. There was a silence. You want to trap yourself with them? Tsiritava said. I want to put us somewhere they cannot escape and cannot maneuver, Vassanthacumer said. We do better in confined spaces than they do. We think faster in chaos. I want chaos. Another silence. Then Tsiritava said, I believe you are the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. Vassanthacumer reportedly smiled and said, we prefer the word determined. The Battle of the Calveth Margin lasted 31 hours. I'm not going to walk you through every engagement. What I want to give you is the atmosphere of it, the texture. Imagine 340,000 humans in ships that their own engineers had built in 18 months, sitting in the dark in the middle of an asteroid field, running minimal power, watching their sensors for the first sign of Crethali approach. Imagine the quiet of that, the controlled, professional quiet that settles over people who have committed to something and are waiting for it to begin. And then imagine it beginning. The Crethali fleet entered the margin at 400 hours. They came through in columns, using the transit corridors exactly as Vasanthacumer had predicted. Their lead elements were heavily shielded, designed to absorb the kind of long-range fire that sovereignty doctrine would have thrown at them. They were not expecting short-range ambush from positions they thought were empty asteroid clusters. The human fleet opened up from 300 separate positions simultaneously. What followed was, there's no clean word for it, not a battle in the traditional sense. Not the kind of engagement where two fleets line up and exchange fire at tactical range. What followed was 31 hours of the most chaotic, close-quarters, point-blank engagement in recorded interstellar warfare. The Crethali tried to reorganize, tried to form defensive clusters, tried to punch through the human positions to the exits of the transit corridors. Vasanthacumer had planned for that. Every time the Crethali formed a coherent formation, human ships broke the formation from inside it. Every time the Crethali tried to push toward an exit corridor, human forces were already there, emerging from asteroid cover that the Crethali sensors hadn't registered as threatening. Commander Lena Zorik, who commanded a squadron of 6 human attack craft during the battle, gave testimony later about what it was like to fight in the margin. She said there was no clear view for most of it, debris jamming close in fire, you couldn't see more than a few thousand kilometers in any direction. What you could see was your immediate situation. And your immediate situation was always urgent, always requiring a decision. I made probably 400 decisions in 31 hours. Some of them were good, some of them were wrong, none of them had time to be perfect. She paused. That's actually where we live, I think, in the space where decisions can't be perfect. Most people, most species, maybe, need a little more certainty before they act. We don't. We act and we adjust, act and adjust, over and over. In the margin, that was the difference. The Crethali fleet suffered catastrophic losses. Not total destruction. The Crethali were not without their own adaptive capacity, and a significant portion of their fleet did break through and withdraw. But the losses were, by every assessment, beyond what the Crethali had calculated as acceptable. And more importantly, more strategically important, when the battle ended and the analysis came in, the Crethali did something they had not done since the war began. They sued for a ceasefire. Not peace, not surrender, but a ceasefire, a pause, a request for negotiation. 63 years of war, and the first time in 63 years that the Crethali had asked for a pause. The transmission was received by the sovereignty on what the human calendar marked as February 14th, 2090. It took 3 weeks for the implications to fully settle. In that time, Admiral Vasanthacumer was recalled to Earth briefly for consultations. She gave a press conference. She was asked by a reporter how she felt about what the human fleet had accomplished. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I feel like we did what needed to be done. I feel like my people, the people who built those ships in 18 months, who flew them across distances that shouldn't be crossable, who sat in the dark in an asteroid field and waited, who held relay stations alone for 19 hours, who turned a ship broadside in front of a warship with no weapon to answer with. I feel like those people deserve to have someone lead them who was worthy of what they were capable of. I hope I was. I'm not sure I always was, but they were extraordinary. Every one of them." She was asked if she thought the war was over. She said, "No, but I think for the first time the universe understands what it got when it reached out to us. And I think the Crethali understand it too. They got humanity. And humanity doesn't know how to stop." Part 4, the things we carried. The weight of being any deity. After the Calveth margin, the human deployment expanded. More ships, more personnel. The volunteer roles stayed full, in fact, they stayed fuller than full, because every week of the war produced more evidence that what the humans were doing out there mattered, and every week of evidence produced more people who couldn't sit still. But the expansion brought something else, something that doesn't get talked about as much as the battles and the victories and the tactical innovations. It brought weight. The people fighting this war were far from home in a way that no human being had ever been far from home before. They were light years from Earth. Light years from anyone who knew them, who had grown up with them, who remembered what they looked like when they were small and afraid and didn't know yet what they'd become. They were fighting for a civilization they couldn't even see anymore. I want to talk about a medic named Corporal James Osei. He was 24 years old. He was from Accra. He had been studying nursing before the war and had enlisted with the medical corps because, as he told the friend who drove him to the enlistment center, they're going to need people who know how to fix things. Osai was deployed with a forward medical unit attached to a mixed human Velhari ground support team on the surface of a moon called Peloran II, during the stabilization operations that followed the breaking of the siege. It was not frontline combat work. It was field medicine, trauma stabilization, triage, trying to keep damaged things alive long enough for them to get to somewhere better. The patients were not always human. This is something that gets glossed over sometimes. The human medics early in the deployment had to learn to treat alien physiologies they'd never studied for. They had field manuals. They had translation tools. They had, in many cases, a sovereignty medical liaison who could advise. But they also frequently had situations where the liaison wasn't available and the patient was in front of them and something had to happen. Osa describes one night in particular. A Nesari soldier, one of the thin, translucent species I mentioned earlier, had taken fragmentation damage that had compromised his internal systems in ways that the field manual didn't cover clearly. Os had perhaps 12 minutes before the damage became irreversible. He said, "I looked at the manual, I looked at the patient, I looked at the injury, and I thought this is like a vascular rupture, that's what this looks like. It's different tissue, different chemistry, but the mechanism is the same, and if it's a vascular rupture, I know what to do." He did what he would have done for a vascular rupture. It worked. The Nesari soldier survived. Osai said, "I was shaking afterward. You know, that kind of shaking that comes after, when your body finally lets itself feel what just happened. I sat down on the floor of that field tent, and I shook for probably 3 minutes. And then another patient came in, and I got up." He got up. He just got up. There are hundreds of stories like Osai's across the deployment. Hundreds of moments where someone in a field tent, or a damaged compartment, or a tunnel in an asteroid, or a relay hub 19 hours into an assault looked at an impossible situation and did the most human thing imaginable. They tried anyway. The sovereign debt. 2 years into the human deployment, a researcher on the sovereignty's diplomatic staff submitted a classified report to the Emergency Council. The report was titled, in translation, something like Observations on the Human Alliance, Strategic Implications for Long-Term Sovereignty-Human Relations. It was 43 pages long. I've read the publicly released version, which has some sections redacted, and I want to tell you what I think is the most important passage in it. The researcher wrote, "The human species represents a unique case in sovereignty diplomatic history. In 63 years of conflict with the Crethali, the sovereignty has accepted assistance from allied species in the form of resource contributions, personnel, and logistical support. In most cases, such assistance was contingent, provided in exchange for security guarantees, territorial arrangements, or material compensation. Human assistance has been provided in the absence of any such arrangement. When pressed on this point, human representatives consistently give answers that are difficult to process within standard diplomatic frameworks. The most common response in various formulations is, 'It was the right thing to do.' When asked how they arrived at that conclusion, they typically describe a simple calculus. Something wrong was happening. They were in a position to help, therefore they helped. The sophistication of this calculus is not in its logic, but in its execution. The humans do not appear to find it difficult to move from "it is right to help" to "therefore I am helping." The gap that other species experience between moral recognition and moral action appears in humans to be significantly narrower. This has military implications. It also has philosophical ones that this report is not equipped to fully address. The gap between moral recognition and moral action appears, in humans, to be significantly narrower. I read that sentence 3 times when I first encountered it. Because I think it's exactly right. And I think it's the most important thing anyone, human or otherwise, has ever said about us. We don't always do the right thing. I want to be honest about that. Human history is full of moments where the gap was enormous, where people saw wrong happening and did nothing, where the calculus failed, where the will collapsed. We are not perfect. We are not always brave. We are not always good. But when we are good, when something inside us catches fire around a thing that matters, the gap closes very fast. And apparently, to the rest of the universe, that is remarkable. The ceasefire. The Krethali ceasefire request led to 8 months of negotiations. I won't take you through the details of those negotiations. They were complex and difficult, and involved a level of diplomatic sophistication that I don't have the background to properly represent. What I can tell you is the shape of the outcome. The Krethali agreed to withdraw to their pre-war territorial boundaries. They agreed to a monitored ceasefire zone. They agreed to a framework for future negotiations. They did not surrender. They did not acknowledge responsibility for what 63 years of expansion had done to the sovereignty. But they stopped. And the stopping, after 63 years, was everything. There are different theories about what produced the ceasefire. Some analysts believe the Battle of the Kalvith Margin was the primary driver, that the Krethali simply took losses they hadn't anticipated and needed time to absorb them. Some believe it was the cumulative effect of 18 months of human tactical unpredictability, which had begun to genuinely disrupt Krethali operational planning in ways that weren't sustainable. Some believe it was something more fundamental, that the Krethali, for the first time, encountered an opponent whose commitment to the fight they could not model. You can't predict what an enemy will do when you have no model for their threshold of retreat. If the enemy has no threshold of retreat, if every time you increase the cost, they find a way to pay it, there's no winning against that. The return. The first human fleet came home in stages, starting in late 2091 and completing through most of 2092. The homecomings were not uniform. Some were large public celebrations, parades, ceremonies, the kind of organized public gratitude that societies produce when they know they need to mark a moment. Some were quieter. Some were very quiet indeed. There were people who didn't come home. There were always people who didn't come home. And the weight of that, the specific individual weight of each person who had gone and not returned, lived in every family, every neighborhood, every community that had sent someone. Captain Roland Ichterberg, the man who had turned the Amaranth broadside between a Krethali scout and a vessel full of refugees, came home to Auckland and went back to maritime cargo work. He said in an interview that he was glad to be doing something simple. He said the stars looked different to him now, though he couldn't quite explain how. He said, "I know what's out there now. I know what's moving around in the dark. And I know that we went out there and we did something. I don't know that I'll ever be able to say what exactly. I just know that it needed doing and we did it. And now I'm here, and the stars look different." Chief Engineer Sumin had received the sovereignty's highest military honor, a designation that translates as something like Lightkeeper, given to individuals whose actions directly preserved the lives of sovereignty citizens in moments of crisis. She accepted it in a ceremony attended by representatives of all 9 sovereignty species, standing in a hall on a station that existed because she and 37 others had refused to leave it. She said in her acceptance remarks, "I want to be clear about something. None of us who were on VOS 7 believed we were being heroes. We believed we were doing a job. We had a job to do and we stayed to do it. That's all. But I'll tell you what I think about now. I think about the fact that the reason we stayed is because we knew what would happen if we didn't. We knew that somewhere else people were depending on those communications, people who didn't know our names and never would. And that was enough. That was more than enough. I think that might be the most human thing I know how to say. It was enough to help people whose names I'd never learn." Corporal James Osei returned to Accra. He finished his nursing degree. He works, as of the last account I've read, in a pediatric ward. He has said in a few public discussions that he thinks about his time with the deployment often, but that it doesn't feel like a different life to him. It feels continuous. It feels like the same thing he's doing now, seeing what's broken and trying to fix it. Admiral Priya Vasanthakumar retired from active service in 2093. She taught at the Global Space Alliance Academy for 7 years. She wrote a memoir that sold more copies than any military memoir since the 20th century. In the final chapter, she wrote something that I want to end with, or nearly end with, because I think it's the truest thing in the whole long, complicated, remarkable story of what humanity did when the universe asked if anyone was coming. She wrote, "People ask me what we were fighting for. They want a clean answer. They want to hear freedom or survival or principle. And those things are true, but they're not the whole truth. The whole truth is messier. The whole truth is that we went because we couldn't not go. Because the message came and we read it and we understood in a way that didn't require explaining or justifying that this was our problem now. Not because it was our war, not because the sovereignty was our friend. Not because we knew we'd win, because God knows we didn't know that. We went because something terrible was happening to people who were nothing like us, who looked nothing like us, who had nothing we wanted and nothing we needed, and we had the capacity to try to stop it. And when that's true, when you have the capacity to try, the question of whether to go isn't really a question at all. We went. We always go. 63 years of war changes a civilization. It changes its priorities, its self-conception, its relationship with the concept of safety. The sovereignty had spent 6 decades fighting and losing and adapting and losing, and not being beaten but also, crucially, not winning. And then humanity had arrived. The reorientation wasn't immediate, it wasn't clean. There were political arguments within the sovereignty about what the human involvement meant, about what the long-term relationship should look like, about whether humanity's methods were admirable or alarming or both. There's a Velhari philosopher named Ashatev, unrelated to the Commodore I mentioned earlier, who wrote a treatise about this period that became enormously influential within sovereignty academic circles. The title in translation is something like The Weight of Watching. In it, he argues that the most significant thing the sovereignty gained from the human deployment was not military advantage, though that was real. It was not tactical innovation, though that was also real. It was a change in what the sovereignty thought was possible. He writes, for 63 years we had been fighting within a framework of limitations that we did not recognize as a framework. We believed the limits were the reality. We believed that the cost of the war was fixed, that there was only so much sacrifice available, only so much will to be spent, only so much that could be demanded of any creature before the demand exceeded what was there. The humans showed us that this was not a feature of the universe. It was a feature of us. The limits we believed in were our limits. They were not universal. And that knowledge, the simple, transformative knowledge that the limits were not universal, changed what we thought we were capable of. He goes on to argue that this is, in his view, the defining characteristic of the human species, and perhaps humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization. Not their weapons or their tactics or their willingness to die, but the fact of their example. The fact that they showed up. The fact that they showed up when no one expected them to, when the math said they shouldn't have, when the rational calculation was to say, not our war, not our problem, we understand if you refuse. And instead they said, tell us where we're coming. The memorial. On a station in the Peloran system, the system where the first human fleet made first contact with the sovereignty's military, where the siege of Peloran Prime was broken, where 3,700 Velhari engineers who had never met a human before watched a human admiral commit her ships to an engagement ratio that made no sense on paper, there is a memorial. It was built by the sovereignty, not requested by humanity, not negotiated, not commissioned as part of any diplomatic arrangement. The sovereignty built it because they wanted to. It's not a monument in the way that most human memorials are monuments. It doesn't have a statue or an inscription in the traditional sense. What it has is a chamber, a circular room about 20 meters across, with walls made of a material that I'm told shifts transparency over a cycle of about 3 hours. Translucent, then clear, then translucent again. And when the walls are clear, you see the space outside the station, the stars, the system, the particular dark that exists out there between things. At the center of the room is a single display. Not a screen exactly, more like a surface that holds light in a specific shape. The shape is a human handprint. And beneath it, in every language of the sovereignty, and in English, and in every language that humans speak. They came when we had stopped hoping anyone would. I think about that handprint sometimes. I think about 40 million people volunteering in 72 hours. I think about the shipyards running at 3 in the morning with terrible coffee and workers who didn't go home. I think about Chternberg turning his unarmed ship broadside and saying you will have to go through me. I think about Hans' 43 engineers in that relay station. I think about Osei on the floor of a field tent, shaking, getting up. I think about Vassanthakumar in the Calveth margin, choosing chaos because she knew her people could live in it. I think about the 4 words, tell us where we're coming. And I think we are a species full of contradictions, full of failure, full of history that we should be ashamed of and lessons we've learned too slowly and mistakes we've made twice when once should have been enough. We are not the heroes of every story. We are not always the good ones. But when the call came from the dark, when something out there was dying and needed someone to come, when no alien army could save them, when the sovereignty looked around a universe they'd been fighting in for 63 years and ran 14,000 projections, and found that the variable that changed the outcome, the one variable, was us. We answered. We showed up. We turned our ships into the fire, and we stayed until the thing was done. And I think that matters. I think it matters more than I know how to say. The last thing, there's one more story I want to tell. After the ceasefire, after the negotiations, after the first human fleet came home, a Nesari child, one of the 400 civilians evacuated by the Amaranth, one of the people that Ichterberg had put his unarmed ship between a Krethali warship and the universe for this child, who had been 6 years old at the time of the evacuation, who was now 8, who had grown up hearing the story of the human ship that came and sat between her people and the thing that wanted to kill them. This child's parent wrote a letter. It was addressed to the crew of the Amaranth. It was delivered through the Sovereignty's diplomatic office. It arrived, eventually, at the Global Space Alliance's logistics headquarters in Oslo. And from there it was forwarded to the Amaranth's surviving crew members, 31 who had set out, 30 who came home, because one had been lost in a later engagement. A woman named Fatima al-Rashid who had been 26 years old and from Amman and who had voted yes along with everyone else. The letter was translated. The parent, the Nesari, use a pronoun I'll render as ver, which covers their equivalent of parental role, ver wrote. My child was 6. My child does not fully remember that night. What my child remembers is that something came out of the dark and put itself between us and the thing that wanted us gone. My child grew up knowing that happened, growing up knowing that it changed something in ver. My child is not afraid of the dark, not because the dark is safe, but because ver knows that in the dark, things can move toward you and the things moving toward you are not always what you fear. Sometimes what moves toward you is something that decided to come, something that chose you. I have spent 2 years trying to find the words to say what that means. I don't think my language has them. What I can say is this: because of you, my child is not afraid. I don't know how to explain to you what that is worth.